Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Every Man's Thoughts. Spoiler warning, boys and girls, as today we are breaking down the first episode of House of the Dragon. Now that you've been warned, let's get to it. As I get started, the first thing I want to say is this video is going to be more negative than I anticipated and certainly more negative than I had hoped. However, I also don't want to discourage people from watching, so please stay tuned to the end where I cover some significant positives, including why I think the show has a chance to become something special, particularly once the writers have had a chance to start storytelling and getting away from raw exposition. Speaking of exposition, my disappointment started with the very first scene and the opening prologue. As I am familiar with the original book, I had an understanding of what time frame and characters the show was going to focus on. But I was still surprised that the opening prologue didn't do anything to cover the prehistory of the Targaryen dynasty. No mention of Aegon the Conqueror, his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys, etc., which felt like a desperate attempt to stand on the shoulders of the Game of Thrones series instead of standing on their own 2 feet. The next thing that caught my eye was the mediocre CGI, particularly with the dragons and the exterior scenes, and we're still in the first 10 minutes of the episode. By contrast, the interior scenes were quite well done. They had the look and feel of the Westeros I remember and added to the overall grandeur of the show. But every time we reverted to a panoramic or exterior scene, the CGI, I don't want to say the CGI was bad, but it was obvious, and in this day and age, I don't know that obvious CGI gets a passing grade. These are just minor concerns, though. Technically, the prologue is already permanently behind us, and the CGI could improve as the season wears on, or a worst case in Season 2. Of significantly greater consequence are the issues of dialogue and casting. In defense of the writing team, the first show in any new series is always the most difficult to write. You have to introduce 10 to 15 characters, the main plot, half a dozen subplots, and you have an hour to do it. That being said, the dialogue isn't up to the quality of the original Game of Thrones even in its first episode. Although the quality overall needs improvement, the foremost stumbling block for the show so far is how it deals with female characters and women's issues. Historically, we've had 2 types of female characters, the irrelevant window dressing, or in more recent times, the stunning and brave Mary Sue. One of the things that makes George R.R. Martin's work so good is that he breaks that mold. When he writes female characters, he doesn't treat them any different than when he writes a male character. They have their own narrative, they deal with their own problems in their own way in the context of the fantasy world in which they reside. They are neither diminished nor placed on a pedestal or transitioned into acting exactly like a man. This episode struggled with this early on. They didn't want to give the audience credit for having any intelligence, so they decided to beat you over the head with the narrative. Hopefully, once they've had time and the characters are established, this will provide the necessary foundation for them to build on and ascend into superior entertainment like the original Game of Thrones, instead of remaining caught in this trap and being relegated to mediocrity like Wheel of Time. The last negative I want to talk about is the cast themselves. No, I'm not saying anybody involved is a bad actor. In fact, over time, I'm sure we're going to see some true standouts emerge, just like every other show ever. What I am saying is, as the show stands right now, there's no actor involved at the center who has a pre-existing gravitas to compel you or draw you into the story. If you recall, the original Game of Thrones had Sean Bean as Ned Stark and Mark Addy as Robert Baratheon. Both were dead before the end of Season 1, but they kept you intrigued until you became emotionally attached to the other characters. As it is right now, House of the Dragon simply doesn't have that. In fact, the reason you're seeing this review on Monday and not Sunday is because I fell asleep twice while watching the premiere. Enough with the negativity, let's move on to something a little more fun and the positives and why I have serious hope for this show's future. There's a lot of little things I liked here. I mentioned the interior set design earlier, the armor, the weapons, some of the cinematography and the editing. There's obviously a lot of talent here, far more than any other streaming service. HBO knows what they're doing. All the little things are nice, but there are 2 huge positives I want to drill down upon because I think they will determine the success or failure of the show long term. The first was staying true to the books, particularly related to sex and violence. With any adaptation, some changes just have to be made. It's inevitable. Unfortunately, it's quite common for people behind a show to casually abandon the source material because it facilitates the insertion of their beliefs into what the story should have been all along. Based on the comments we heard from people involved with the show leading up to the premiere, I was concerned that they would similarly abandon key elements of this story, particularly graphic violence and intimate content, but as of yet, that hasn't happened. For clarification, I wouldn't want to see any of this in Middle-earth because that's not the world that Tolkien created and it's not what he wrote about. By contrast, these themes are central to the story that George R.R. Martin writes and therefore are necessary for a faithful adaptation. Finally, we get to the single biggest positive, and in my opinion, the most important thing that happened in episode 1. This is, of course, the combination of the sofa scene and then the birthing scene. On the sofa, or whatever piece of furniture that was, the older Rhaenys explains to the younger Rhaenyra that the discomfort related to maternity is how they serve the realm, and that the childbed is their battlefield, and they should face it with a stiff lip. Later, we then see a brutal birthing scene juxtaposed with the violence of the joust. So why is this so important? With the direct comparison between the birthing and the joust, we rightfully elevate the obligations of the female character to be the equal of her male counterparts. Just as important, it accomplishes this without denigrating her traditional role within that society or diminishing her male counterparts. In fact, if you were to think about it, in essence, she's elevating all women. Earlier, I mentioned how heavy-handed and obvious they were when dealing with these issues, but here they summon the requisite skill and effort it takes to do something that actually enhances the story. If they can continue down this path and do a better job of building upon the characters they established in episode 1, then House of the Dragon will have a leg up on Wheel of Time or Rings of Power as they're mired in their own self-destructive narratives. I haven't spent a lot of time in this video talking about the actual story, and to be honest, that's largely because there really wasn't one. At least not one that was worth spending any time on. Hopefully that will change in the videos to come. Well, that's it for me. I will see you next time.